On today's episode, I'll refinish and repair this coffee table. This table was made by the Drexel Furniture Company in the 1950s. I'm always happy to find a piece from Drexel. I've always found them to be well made and stylish. This one, though, was going to need some work to get it looking presentable again. The worst damage was on the top. It was in bad need of a refinish. There were large patches where the finish was missing completely, and there were also a few black water stains on the top. The legs were loose and would need to be reglued. There is evidence of some previous repairs on the underside of the drawer. It looks like somebody tried to glue the drawer front back on. There's also a large chip in the veneer on the corner of the drawer front. This is the support for the leaf. It just slides in and out of its little pocket. I began by removing the leaves, and this would just make it easier to move the table around as I worked on it, and it would make it easier to work on the leaves. All I had to do was remove the screws from the big hinge. And here we can see the area under where the hinge was attached. It's unfinished, so it gives us a clear view of the construction of the leaf, and presumably the rest of the tabletop. So it looks like it's solid wood in the middle with the veneer on the top and bottom. And it's narrow strips of wood glued together edge to edge. I also wanted to remove the drawer at this point, but I couldn't because there was a dowel, actually two dowels, inserted into the space where the drawer goes that prevented it from being removed. You can't see the dowels now, but they go in through the side of the drawer cavity and they catch the face of the drawer to prevent it from being removed. So I left the drawer in there, at least for the time being. I then removed the legs, and I started by taking out any screws that were holding them on. And then I had to address the glue blocks. Some of them were already loose. I could slide a spatula in between the block and the apron, and the two weren't connected at all. But there were a few that were still glued together. So to help get those removed, I took a heat gun and warmed them up to soften the glue. And here you can kind of see the warm glue oozing up. And then I could get the spatula in there and get the two separated. And then I could just take a rubber mallet and give the legs a few taps. And off they came. Next, I scraped the finish off of the top. This was a lacquer finish, and what was left of it came off easily. It was pretty thin and brittle. Once the lacquer was removed, I didn't find any stain underneath it, or at least I didn't find any wood stain. There were plenty of stains like the black water stains, but it looked like the finish on the top just consisted of the lacquer finish as opposed to a wood stain or a glaze to add color underneath the lacquer. And it was hard to tell if this was a clear lacquer or if they had tinted it with some color. It did have a little bit of a brownish look to it, but it was hard to tell if that was just from discoloration over the decades or if that was actual color that they added to the lacquer. Once I had scraped off as much finish as I could, I sanded the top with some 120 grit sandpaper. And this would remove any little pieces of finish that I had missed. Once the sanding was done, then I needed to address these black stains. These look like black water stains created by water sitting on the tabletop. The two biggest stains were this one and the black circle on the top. So to try and remove these, I applied some oxalic acid and I wiped it over the entire tabletop. I didn't apply it just to the stains because then you might end up with a light spot in those areas where the oxalic acid had bleached the wood. So if you apply it to the entire tabletop, the whole thing will get evenly bleached, and hopefully your black stains will be removed in the process. And when I say that the top will be bleached, it's actually a very subtle effect. I've found that the bleaching effect on any wood that's not stained is pretty subtle. It doesn't get a lot lighter. But on any black water stains, those can be drastically reduced or could disappear entirely with the oxalic acid. So I applied it and then I let it sit on there overnight. When I came back the next day and washed it off, I found that the stain on the end of the table was completely gone. And the black circle was almost gone. It had been lightened a lot, especially this half was almost gone completely. And the other half, there were still a few dark marks, but it was a lot better than it was. So at this point, I left what was left of the black stain for the moment, and I would come back to it later to see if there was anything else that I could do to it to try to make it disappear more. Next, it was time to scrape the finish on the legs. And this finish was a little different from the finish on the top. The legs are made of solid wood. There's no veneer on them, as there is on the top. I'm not sure what kind of wood this is, but some of the legs had some grain that looked kind of greenish and reminded me of poplar. So that's my best guess, that they may be poplar. They had a thin lacquer coat on the top, but unlike the top of the table, these also had a layer of some colored stain or glaze beneath the lacquer. And I could tell that there was a stain on it because the natural color of the wood you can see up by the dowels is pretty light. And before I disassembled the table, you could even see where they got a little sloppy with the stain at the factory and got a big smudge of it here on the apron. So they probably put this stain on here to get the legs closer to the color of the veneer on the top. And that colored stain wasn't going to scrape off easily because it wasn't really a film finish like the lacquer on top. It had soaked into the grain of the wood more. So to get that out, I just sanded the legs. Once I had the legs stripped, I could see that some of them did have a little bit of staining at the bottom. Looked like maybe they had been sitting in some water or in a very damp place and absorbed moisture through the bottom of the leg. So I went over these as well with the oxalic acid to try to remove those stains. Next, I could glue up the legs, and I did this in 2 steps. First, I glued the legs onto the end apron piece, and I first did a dry fit with no glue just to make sure they fit together properly, and I added some tape to help keep the glue squeeze out off of the unfinished wood. Then I could add the glue and clamp them up. Once that was dry, then I could glue the legs back onto the table. The edge of the tabletop and the leaves had some dark stain on them, probably the same stuff that was on the legs. And this was done to hide the wood that was used as the core of the tabletop in between the veneers. And this wood was very light, so this stain was used to darken it up. And it wasn't going to come off very well with scraping, especially on the ends where it was applied to the end grain of the wood and really soaked in. So to get this off, I used this little detail sander, and it's actually the first time I've used it on one of these projects, but it worked really well to get that stain off. The front of the drawer had a chip in the veneer, and it was a pretty big chip in the corner. And there was also a chunk of the wood taken out of the top of the drawer front in that same spot. I didn't have any veneer that looked anything like this veneer on the table, so I decided to repair it using some epoxy putty. This is a 2-part epoxy. You just slice off whatever amount you need. And mix the 2 parts together, and then apply it to your repair. I tried to get it as close to the final shape as I could to reduce any sanding that I'd have to do once it dried. And notice that I left a little bit of the old finish around the repair area. and this just helps to keep any of the epoxy off of the veneer. Once it was dry, then I fine-tuned it with some sandpaper and removed that little bit of the original finish that was left. I wanted to try and clean up some of this glue squeeze out on the drawer from a previous repair that somebody did before I had the table. And it looks like they may have used a foaming polyurethane glue that tends to get all over the place. So I just used a chisel to try to get as much of this off as I could. And while I was doing that, I noticed that one of the drawer fronts was loose. So I wanted to reglue that. I needed to get it disassembled so I could reglue it. And I started by applying some heat to the joints to soften the glue, and then used a rubber mallet to persuade it to come apart. And once I had it apart, I found more evidence of somebody's previous glue job with the foamy glue. And now that I had that drawer front off, I could remove the drawer from the table. Previously, those dowels in the sides were preventing it from coming out, but since that drawer front was off, I could take it out completely, which would make it a lot easier to work on. And I made the executive decision to just remove those dowels. It seemed like they weren't really necessary, and it would make it a lot easier for me to work on the table without those dowels in there, so I could easily take the drawer in and out. And then I could glue the drawer front back on. And I first removed as much of that old glue as I could. Then I put on some new glue and clamped it up. Then it was time to start adding finish. There were a few different colors happening with the table. As you can see here on this side view, here I'm just wetting down the wood so that we can see what the color of the wood would be if I just put a clear finish on it. I knew that I wanted to do just a clear finish on the top and the aprons, the pieces that had the fancy veneer on them. But as you can see here, the edge of the tabletop, the core in between the veneer, doesn't look good on its own. It's a little bit greenish, which makes me think that it's probably poplar. And the legs aren't that great looking compared to the veneer on the top and the apron. So I wanted to stain the edge of the table and the legs to bring them a little closer to the veneer on the top. And to do this, I used some gel stain and I mixed two colors together. I mixed Candlelight and I think it was Prairie Wheat. The Prairie Wheat on its own would have been too light and the Candlelight was too dark. But when I mixed a little bit of the Candlelight in the Prairie Wheat, it gave me a nice color that worked well with the color of the veneer on the top. So I just wiped that onto the legs and the edge of the table. Once the stain had dried, then I could add the clear top coat, and in this case I'm using an oil-based satin wipe-on polyurethane. Here I'm applying it to the top, and this is with no stain, just the clear polyurethane. And I was really happy with how this looked, especially considering what I started with. After I got a coat of clear finish on the drawer, I worked on touching up the repair that I made in the corner with the epoxy. Having the clear finish on there brings out the true color of the veneer, so it'll be easier for me to match the color of the touch-up. I took some of these dry pigments and mixed them in with some clear shellac, and then I brushed it on to try to blend in the repair with the rest of the veneer. And this was pretty tricky, so I'm not going to show the entire thing because it was a lot of trial and error, a lot of brushing on and then wiping off, and brushing on, wiping off. It can be really hard to get it to blend in because the pigmented shellac reflects light differently than the wood does. So even if the color is close, depending on what angle you're looking at it from, the touched up area can really grab your eye because the light is not reflecting off of it like it is on the surrounding wood. So that's one challenge. And also, it looks different depending on what angle you're looking at it from. From one angle, it can look great, and then you go look at it from the opposite direction and it looks terrible. But thankfully, this wood has a few different colors in it, and it's got a lot of variation in the grain, so that helped a little bit to blend in the repair area, since there's already a lot of variation in the veneer naturally. And also, you have to keep in mind, how is this piece going to be viewed? So for instance, this drawer is not going to be viewed as I have it here by anybody. This corner is going to be pretty much hidden under the overhang of the top of the coffee table, unless somebody pulls the drawer out. So I had to keep that in mind. And I got it to this point here and decided to change its position, and I put it horizontally as it would be in the coffee table, and then adjusted the color a bit more from there. I also mixed up a few different colors to touch up some spots on the top of the table. These were just small areas that I filled with some wood filler and just needed to be blended in a little bit. I also touched up the top where that big black circle was. Most of it was gone, but if you looked at the table from the angle that the camera is looking at it now, you could still see it a little bit. It's faint, but it's still there. So I wanted to try and make it disappear even a little bit more. So I concentrated on the largest and darkest spots of the circle and tried to lighten those. And I didn't do too much. I didn't want to end up making it even more noticeable. So I just did a little bit and then left it as it was. After I did all the touch ups, I went over them with a couple more coats of clear polyurethane. And here it is, all finished. Thanks for watching.